All right. Hello, everybody. So today I will be presenting on the art of batik. So this will be kind of an overview about the history of the art, where it comes from, cultural influences, how to use it, what you need to do it, and kind of what it looks like today. So just to give an overview of what we're going to be looking through, like I said before, what it is, its history, how it affects culture, the tools you'll need to do it, the process of doing it, and kind of the difference between artists, the way the product is sold, and what modern batik looks like. And just to preface too, the images throughout the presentation are actually either handmade versions of by individuals who practice this craft, or it comes from people who mass produce the fabrics that have these types of patterns on them. So what is batik? So it is an Indonesian technique of wax resistant dyeing applied to whole cloth. So I'm saying batik, sometimes I'll say batik, but the correct pronunciation is batik. And so obviously like on your left, you can probably see all these like beautiful, super intricate designs. And the word batik comes from the Indonesian word for to dot. And that's because the main way of decorating these fabrics is either through using lines or dots. So it's kind of deriving from that general theme of the art. So it originated in Java, Indonesia. It's where it got its most known form today of the stylistic elements. And so their design is the most well-known across the world, but it has been adapted by other cultures as well. So some history of kind of wax-resistant dyeing. It actually started back in Egypt. And then since then, it's been practiced in several different cultures. Actually back in Egypt, just to add a little bit more to that, the original way of using it was that they would dip the pieces of fabric that they'd wrap the bodies in wax and then use a stylus to decorate them. So when they buried the bodies, it would have like decoration on it. So that's kind of where that came from. And then since then, it's been practiced in several different cultures, including in China in the Tang Dynasty. And then it's been practiced similarly in Nigeria and Senegal, but rather than using wax, they use starch or mud. And so these are all just kind of different iterations of a similar craft. But historians kind of believe that the art itself, like the popularized craft, was created in the 6th or 7th century in India. And so since then it's kind of met its match in Indonesia, where the most modern version of it and the type that we all know today comes from there. And so there's a long history of acculturation. So it's been assimilated into several different cultures in many different ways. And so these different cultures have made it their own. And now there is like a diversity in terms of pattern, quality of workmanship, and technique. So whether that be design elements or materials used, it really changes from country to country. So in regard to world culture, it's been adapted in most countries across the world, but where it's been popularized the most are these few countries right here, a few regions. And so starting from the left to right, top to bottom, there's a native Indonesian version of the craft. So this right here, their craft or their patterns typically pertain to motifs of Java. So it's different patterns that have meaning to the culture there, meaning to different areas of the country, dependent on where the artisan is from. And so that's kind of one of the examples of a popularized pattern from that area. And then in Japan, one popular symbol that's used a lot are cherry blossoms or butterflies or things of that nature. So they tend to appear a lot on batik fabrics. In Islam nations, there's a lot of Arabic calligraphy. And so that's kind of met some influence on there, whether it be words of meaning or symbols of meaning that end up on the cloth. In China, some popular symbols are the dragon and the phoenix. And then India, it's peacocks and elephants. And then in Europe, it's more fairy tale like images, a little bit more floral. But yeah, so those are kind of the main themes from each of those areas of the world. So locally, people who practice this craft, typically women, grew up learning how to do it since childhood. They've been practicing years after years, and later on you'll see a few videos of me trying, and it is extremely difficult to make it anywhere near as beautiful as these pieces of art. It's very, very difficult. Definitely takes a lot of practice. So a lot of people grew up learning how to do this. It was typically in a town or village that produces that as an export, and it's kind of a source of their economy. Um, and something in addition to the batik that these towns and locals produce, another thing that they can produce along with it is the dye that they use for their fabric. And so, especially in more rural areas where they can create natural dyes, where there aren't, where it kind of depends, the colors that you use kind of depend on where you are, just because those are the products or the plants that are available to you to use to create these dyes. If you can create a potent dye that people like really like the color of, or it stays really well in fabric and things like that, they can spread around the area and can be a source of the economy for people who live in that region, which is very, very cool. And so some of the plants that grow that you can use to create these potent colors are an indigo plant, mango leaves, or mahogany wood. There's a ton of other ones. I'll get to that a little bit later in my dye presentation, but those are generally some of the more popular sources of natural dyes. And so inland batik in Indonesia is typically more traditional with indigenous patterns and earth tone colors. That is due to the fact that that is what the people within the area want to purchase. It's what type of dyes they have available to them in that area, as opposed to the coastal batik, who uses brighter colors with images from numerous cultures. So there's a few reasons for that. By living on the coast, they're exposed to more imports from other countries. So they have exposure to, or just more available resources for other colors from other areas of the world. Whereas inland batik, they don't have that availability. It's extremely difficult to get different colors or synthetic dyes out there. But when you live on the coast, it's a lot easier to get your hands on those. And typically the coastal regions use images from other cultures, because when tourists come to Indonesia, they want to see pictures that they know. They want pictures that represent them. They don't necessarily want the traditional Indonesian batik. They want something that represents their nation. They want something that represents them on that piece of fabric that they're going to be wearing. So artisans in Indonesia, especially on the coast, tend to try to use influences from other cultures so as to appeal to people who are visiting the country, which is very interesting. It's just a better way of kind of attracting customers. So the design tools. So I'll just kind of work my way through them. So the chanting, it's spelled like canting, it's pronounced chanting, is basically a wooden tool. It has a wood or bamboo handle and usually a copper spout and a copper pot on top. So it's kind of like it's a handle and then a little pot at the end with a very, very small spout at the tip. And this is what you use for your extremely fine designs. The way that you use it is you take the chanting, you dip it in wax, which is held in a wajan, which I'll get to next, and you fill it up. And then in order to use it, you blow on the tip before starting to use it. And so the responsibility of using a chanting typically falls on women, whereas men typically use the capping or use the cap. I'll get to that in a little bit as well. But yeah, so it's typically done by women, and it's the most intricate designs they use that because of the really, really fine point. So prior to actually putting the wax in the fabric, you have to draw out the pattern. And typically you use a chanting you usually use a chanting to do all of the outlining on any of the designs. So it's definitely a very time consuming utensil or tool, I guess is probably a better word. Extremely time consuming, but it does allow for like the most intricate and unique designs on any of the fabrics. So typically if you find fabric that had been using a chanting, like that's what covered the entire piece of fabric, it's gonna be significantly more expensive than if you bought one that was made with a cap. And so a wajan that I mentioned before, it's kind of a wok looking bowl. It's typically held over a flame or a heat source, and that's where you put your wax while you are waxing your piece of fabric. And so it's typically in that shape because it's pretty easy to get the chanting in there to scoop up the wax, and held over heat just to keep the wax at a consistent temperature that allows it to flow smoothly out of the chanting. So other ways of applying it besides the chanting or applying the wax to the fabric is a stiff brush. And so the stiff brush is usually used to cover a lot larger areas. If you outline something and you want to fill it in quickly and you don't want to waste your time using that tiny, tiny spout to fill it in, you can use a stiff brush just by dipping it in the wax and painting it on like a paintbrush. Then there's the cap. So a cap is basically, people will use metal and they will work it into these very intricate patterns, as you can see here, and they're absolutely beautiful. And so they bend them into these gorgeous designs, and then when they're applying them, you just dip it in the wax and use it like a stamp. And so when you stamp it on, you do it stamps side by side, or you can use it in combination with the chanting, but usually you'll just stamp a pattern across the entire piece of fabric. And in doing that, it's a lot faster to produce. It's much more standardized. And it's a lot cheaper to do because you don't waste as much time making it. But the issue is that they're sold for a lot cheaper. But I looked up like buying a cap just in case I wanted to use one when I was trying to do the craft itself. It's like $115 for one of these. Like, they're expensive. They take time to make. They're absolutely gorgeous, but they're definitely an investment to use for sure. So the dyes, dye can either be natural or synthetic. I kind of explore the ideas of both. So I use synthetic in the one for the piece of fabric that I dyed, and tried to practice batik on. But then I have a presentation about natural dyes, because natural dyes are more traditionally used since they're harvested from plants within the same regions of the country that people reside. And so, yeah, so dye it can either be natural or synthetic. But yeah, so its potency is kind of determined based on how much pigmentation is in it, how much time is spent in the dye, and numerous other factors that I'll get into a little bit later. Then also you clearly have to have wax. So there's two types of wax that are used. It's beeswax and paraffin wax. Beeswax is much more soft and malleable and adheres really well to cotton. Paraffin's a little bit stiffer, doesn't adhere as well, but it keeps the beeswax from spreading out and melting out onto the fabric. It keeps it in a more stiff, thin line. So you need kind of a combination of both. The wax recipes differ person to person. I tried doing a 50-50 mix. It turned out okay, wasn't the best. So it's a very handed down recipe from people who kind of know what they've been doing for a long time and know what mix of the two waxes work best. It also can sometimes be mixed with like resin, but I didn't try doing that myself, but typically it's just the waxes. And then obviously you need your cloth. So cloth is typically, you want a densely woven piece of fabric. You want it to typically be cotton, just because natural fibers absorb dye better. And so you want it to be 100% cotton, and you have to have it clean before you use it. So you have to make sure you wash it to get rid of any impurities such as starch or chalk markings or drawings or anything like that. And traditionally it's beaten with a mallet to get rid of anything else as well. So it's not a huge amount of things that you need to do this craft. It's definitely doable at your home, but it's very specific what you need. But yeah, so those are the design tools. So this is the process on how to create a piece. And so I went through and did it. It took me, I don't know, if I went and did it for like a very intricate design, it would definitely take me a lot longer. I think overall I could create a piece in about an hour. It wouldn't be very good, but these pieces obviously take significantly longer. Some pieces can take up to a year to produce just because they're so layered with colors and just such intricate designs. So it's really a wide range of what you can produce. So to walk you through the process of doing this, first you have to wash your cloth, soak it, and beat it with a large mallet. Like I said before, that's how you can best prepare your cloth to get the best adhesion of the wax. In order to get the dye to stay the best, you need to make sure that the cloth itself is prepared well. Next, you draw your patterns. And so first what you do is you draw your pattern on a sheet of paper. And then typically, like I was talking about a few slides ago, it typically reflects the aesthetics of the artisans or of the area that they're from. And so it usually just has design elements that they're much more familiar with. There's really no standard of what you would use. But there are two predominant patterns, which are dots and lines. So typically that's what that's typically the design elements that people use within their pieces. And so then after that, you transfer that design onto white cloth with a pencil or chalk. So the wax can be applied with several different tools. So that would include the chanting, which is very pen-like, that little small spouted tool that I talked about a moment ago, as well as a stiff brush for larger patterns to fill in those areas, as well as the cap, which covers a lot larger areas much quicker. And so in order for it to be ready to dye, you have to make sure that you wax both sides of it because it won't absorb through. So you need to make sure that you wax both sides prior to putting it into the dye, or else only one side will have the pattern. And after that, so once the wax is dry and the fabric is ready to be colored, the dye is heated in an outdoor basin traditionally, and there's just enough in there to immerse the fabric. And so the longer the bath dye, or the dye bath, excuse me, the darker the color, but the solution tends to corrode the wax. So the longer that you leave it in there, the less likely the wax will stay on the fabric, because when you're preparing the dye, it has to be hot. And when you place, obviously, wax on the fabric into the hot dye, the wax can come off, which would defeat the entire purpose of creating the piece. So you have to make sure you time it right. So 15 minutes is pretty typical for how long people do it. And so after it's been sitting there for about 15 minutes, you have to rinse it underneath running water until the water runs clear. And then after that, these images up top, you can see people hang them out on clothing lines, and you want it to dry in the sun. And so you can repeat this process multiple times by adding more wax to create different designs. And you can use different colors in order to create layers, just to make the pieces more colorful, more intricate. So usually, once you have reached the point where you believe that you're ready or you're done with your product, they typically boil the fabric in hot water to get rid of any wax, so that they can, excuse me, I'm butchering the sentence. Basically, there are a few different things to do once you think you've reached a stopping point. If you don't think that you're done yet, but you want to add wax in different places, you can boil it in hot water, get rid of the wax, and then you can re-wax the piece and keep re-dyeing it. That's one method. Another one is just boiling it or scraping off the wax. You can scrape off the wax with a knife, but it's not very efficient because you don't really get the color that you want. And also there's still wax in the fabric. So if you're trying to dye it again, that piece of the fabric will not get dyed a different color. And then the typical way is boiling it in hot water to get rid of the wax. So basically, when you boil it in the hot water, the wax detaches from the fabric and will float to the top, and then you can take out the fabric. And then it will have the clean lines that are typically associated with the pieces. And so, especially in these smaller areas that produce batik for a living, what they can do is collect the wax on the top once it's all done, and actually reuse it. So it's a very sustainable practice when they're using plants in their area and reusing the wax. It can be very, very sustainable. And so, like I mentioned before, this entire process can take up to a year, depending on how intricate these designs are. So there's a few differences between artists. Some of them can be either from the tools that they use or the tools that they use to dye, stencils that they may use for their designs. Some people work on different types of fabric. Even though cotton's the recommended fabric, people have tried to work on silk or paper even, or even wood. It's kind of a wide range of things that you can experiment with, especially with this form of pattern. And like I mentioned before, the wax recipes really do vary from person to person. And it's kind of a well-kept secret because the better the wax mixture, the more resistant it is to wax. Or the better the wax mixture, the more resistant it is to dye. And I meant to mention this earlier, but wax is also referred to as the resist. And so the resist is basically just a term to use because it resists water and dye, which is great. Does its job. And so then after this, so looking at the way that the product is typically sold, the more intricate the design, the more expensive the piece. So like I said before, the chanting is typically more expensive just because it's significantly more time consuming. It's more intricate. It requires more effort. But then the cap pieces are much quicker and can be mass produced. So they are typically a little bit cheaper. these pieces are typically sold in about 2.5 meter long, sold in about 2.5 meters. And then some of the patterns that are produced are specifically meant for certain parts of the body. So I didn't look into that as much, but it's interesting to see that some design pieces are very, very traditional. They're still traditionally worn today. There's actually my next slide. Modern batik is really coming in strong. So it's still used for ceremonial dress and costume, but it's been showing up a lot in modern fashion. And so I was looking into images of what fashion with batik on it looks like nowadays, and it's kind of having a comeback. It's really showing up in a lot of very famous people's fashion shows. A lot of these images are from 2017 and 2018, which makes sense because of the pandemic right now, that there's not a lot of fashion shows happening, but it is something that seems like it will become and continue to become a world presence of a type of art, which is incredible because it's a gorgeous design. There's so much you can do with it, and it's so representative of the different cultures where it comes from. So I'm excited to see what comes up with it in the future going forward. But yeah, so that's the end of this presentation. This is just kind of an overview of what the art of batik is, how to do it, what it looks like. And so in my next presentation, I will be talking about wax and a lot of its properties. So that is the end of this guy.